So the rest of your handout has a couple of documents that were the integral documents for us. The first one is a trifold brochure where we tried to explain the basic outline of the program. The second is a notice and opportunity to participate. This is just a way of saying, guess what, everybody, we're having this program, and here's the terms that you can participate on. And these buyer participation forms and seller participation forms were included. And that concludes my presentation, and I suspect that the most fun that we're going to have is the questions and answers.
Thank you, Christiane. And anybody have any questions?
I'm Steve Sinclair with Fairfax County, and you mentioned that when you looked at the developing the medallion price of $250,000, you were looking at driver incomes. How did you go about estimating driver incomes? That's always been the big question, about how you do that.
That was the topic of a lot of debate in the town hall meetings. Now, when we go to electronic waybills, and we will very soon, we'll know down to a penny. But until then, we were just subject to discussion. And some people said, well, every time I go out, I can make $300 a night easy. And, other people say, well, I don't know where that number comes from because that seems really unrealistic. What we settled on was that a driver comes home with $120 per shift if they're a night driver. So that was the beginning. Now, but when we also look at driver income, I guess another way of looking at it is the medallion holder income. If you get this medallion, can you pay for it? And so we know that the medallion is going to bring about at least $2,000 to the driver who purchases it. Therefore, $2,000 was sort of the amount that we were looking at in terms of an affordable payment. Okay. Right now, we have a terrible, terrible waybill system. The taxi driver carries a clipboard and tries to write down their stuff, and then on the strength of those waybills, you bring 4 years of waybills into the medallion qualification hearing and prove that you've been a working taxi driver for the last 4 years. It's really impossible. I mean, I think if I were a taxi driver legitimately trying to keep a good waybill, it would be incredibly difficult. And certainly they don't write down things like income. So we are in the process of trying to get to a place where through the GPS that we now have in the cabs, we can measure trip miles, we can measure passengers, we can measure meter fares. I mean, there's so much data that we're going to get through this electronic waybill system, and then the taxi drivers don't have to write down their clipboard stuff anymore. They're not necessarily happy about that.
You mentioned the night shift, $120. What about the day shift?
Less.
Less than the night shift.
Yeah, our day drivers don't make as much as the night drivers do.
So did you try to estimate the total income of the cab per day and then divide it into shifts then?
I think
basically
that
assuming 2 shifts? Or?
We really looked at the operation of the medallion as a business and how much can you expect from driving and how much can you expect from the medallion income. And what are your expenses going to be in the vehicle and the insurance, in the repairs? We tried to do that kind of analysis, and it shocks me that hadn't been done before as far as, I mean, there was no information about how this model worked. I'm sure every business had very tight control over its own data, but as an industry, we had no idea.
Thank you. James Cooper, Edinburgh Napier University. Do you have a view of how many of your drivers work both day shift or night shift, or the split between daytime working, or is it anybody for anything? Because it grabs me that if you do one or the other, the value of the medallion will be substantially different.
Well, in my experience, drivers are usually day drivers or night drivers, and that depends on their own biological rhythms and their family lives and their own preferences, although sometimes they will say, I used to be a day driver, now I'm a night driver, but I don't see them splitting the shifts so much. I guess I don't understand the correlation to the medallion value.
If your day driver has a certain income based on the amount of passengers they pick up, and the nighttime has a different income depending on the number of passengers, that will affect
Yes.
their relative cost of Medallion.
Okay, I understand. Again, the final analysis came down to if you get this Medallion, can you pay for it? Not necessarily do you have the income right now to pay for all of the expenses. And so if you get the Medallion, regardless of whether you're a day driver or night driver, you're going to get the lease income, and the lease income is sufficient to make the loan payments.
Does the the new permit holder have the ability to rent out to the opposite shift, or if they're working full-time to be able to rent it out on weekends, or they have to drive it exclusively themselves?
They have to. Now, we're going through a lot of regulatory reform. We used to say that you had to drive your own vehicle in order to get qualification for working hours. But the Medallion, full-time driving means 800 hours a year. Now, full-time to the rest of us means about 2,000 hours a year. So the Medallion owner can pick and choose their own shifts, again, according to their own preferences. And then the rest of the time, 24/7, that vehicle's on the road with some other driver, whether they arrange their own drivers or the company arranges it for them.
I guess a two-part question. Economists, and I'm not necessarily in that camp, will argue that medallions add what's known as non-value added to the system, and that will often criticize a monopolistic system and only has so many medallions, and they will argue that, gee, they should deregulate the system. I'm more concerned a little bit about the value, or I should say the cost that medallions add to the taxi system and some other regulations which we try to say we want all cab drivers to have livable wage and a number of things which do add to the cost of the taxi system, which is then reflected in the rates. Many communities have had to come back and say, well, in order to protect the taxi system, we have to have a very high initial price for prearranged ground transportation. Is there concern that the medallion system and the way we're regulating it and trying to get livable wages are actually forcing the cost of the taxi system away from users? And we've had a great rise in the prearranged sedan, limos, shuttles, other competitors. Are we, in essence, in perhaps regulating the taxi system to the point where it's losing market share and it's losing it to competitors that aren't necessarily required to follow the same rules and regulations?
No, I don't think it does add cost to the system. And the reason for that is that we looked very carefully at all of the economic ebb and flow. And so a driver who decides to purchase a medallion, if they're on the waiting list, they can stay there for years, and they won't have that medallion income, and they won't have those preferences that a medallion holder gets, such as being able to choose their own shifts and having a little more autonomy. So instead of that, if they purchase the medallion, it's as if they receive it several years early, many years early, and instead of getting the income, that they devote the income to the purchase. And these loan terms are, I think, 5, 7, and 12-year business loans. So it's possible to pay these off very quickly with the medallion income. And during that time, you're increasing your income because you are now a preferred driver. You're a medallion holder, and the company wants to treat you well so that you don't go somewhere else. So the driver is not really losing anything because they wouldn't have had that medallion income if they waited on the waiting list. So they're devoting what they wouldn't have had anyway to pay off the loan to get it, and within a relatively short amount of time, they're going to have an asset that will be very supportive of their long-term goals. So people did say, you're taking money away out of the pockets of drivers. They told me that repeatedly. And I kept asking them, who is losing from this? There's nobody losing from this. No driver is losing money, no company's losing money, no medallion holder's losing money. The only thing that's happening is you're building up equity.
John Scott from San Diego. We're not a medallion city per se. We believe it's a privilege. And I was just wondering if the sale of the medallions have increased service to the people who ride in the taxis.
I have to say that this reform program had really nothing whatsoever to do with taxi service. This was a problem that had kind of gotten stuck in our throats for the last 30 years. We had a lot of people clamoring to reform it, the aging medallion holders, the drivers who weren't getting their medallions, the city that wanted some revenue out of this system. And so when I came in, the only expectation that was communicated to me at the outset was deal with this. And so it did not involve service to the public, except, of course, the point is well taken that if we didn't do this carefully, it could drive up the rates to the public. But I don't see the need for that based on this system. We actually do need a rate increase, but not based on this medallion system. And I have to say also that even though we have created a property right in the medallion, we also consider it a privilege. I heard one driver say that he was going to buy one so that we couldn't revoke it. But that's not the case. We very much can revoke a medallion if people don't meet their permit conditions, and they can take their equity back out and go do something else as a career. So it is both a privilege and a qualified property right. It's very qualified because you can sell it, but you can't choose who you sell it to. It can't be inherited by your children. In the bundle of property rights, it has very few sticks, if you will, but there are some.
Thank you, Christiane. That was great. It was a very different perspective, and congratulations.